leader of the CRIPS reacting to his death sentence. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The silence in courtroom 317 of the Hartford Federal Building was so complete, you could hear the ceiling fans spinning overhead. It was May 14th, 2023, a date that would soon be etched into the nation's memory. Judge Douglas Vance adjusted his glasses and looked down at Dion "Sledge" Moreno, the defendant standing before him. At 32, Sledge had the posture of a much older man, his shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of his orange jumpsuit. The jury had delivered their verdict 2 weeks earlier. Today was merely a formality. Sentencing day. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Vance intoned, his voice carrying the practiced gravity of someone who had sentenced hundreds before. The cameras positioned throughout the courtroom focused on Sledge as he slowly stood. His face remained impassive, almost serene. Those who knew him might have recognized the slight tightening around his eyes, the only visible sign of emotion. Dion Moreno, having been found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Franklin Doyle, this court hereby sentences you to death by lethal injection. The gallery remained still. Death sentences weren't common in Connecticut, but this case had captivated the nation for months. The brutal murder of a prominent businessman, allegedly ordered by a former musical prodigy turned gang leader. It had all the elements of a tragedy too captivating to ignore. Judge Vance continued reading the formal sentencing document, but something changed in the room. There was a shift in energy, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Sledge's attorney, Carla Rivas, seemed to sense it too. She glanced at her client, noticing his right hand moving slowly inside his sleeve. Court officer Thomas Reed would later claim he never saw anything unusual. The metal detectors had been functioning. The defendant had been searched. The impossible was happening anyway. When Judge Vance finished speaking, he asked Sledge if he had any final words before being remanded to await execution. "Actually, Your Honor," Sledge replied, his voice unexpectedly steady, "I think we've all heard enough words in this courtroom." What happened next took only 7 seconds. Sledge's hand emerged from his sleeve, holding what appeared to be a small pistol. He vaulted over the defense table with surprising agility, moving toward the bench before anyone could react. 2 federal marshals reached for their weapons, but froze when Sledge positioned himself behind Judge Vance, the gun pressed against the judge's temple. The courtroom erupted in chaos. People dove under benches. Reporters pushed to get better angles for their cameras. The marshals kept their weapons trained on Sledge but couldn't risk a shot. "Everyone stay calm," Sledge announced, his voice cutting through the panic. "Nobody needs to get hurt today." Judge Vance remained surprisingly composed, his eyes wide but his breathing controlled. "Mr. Moreno," he said quietly, "this won't help your situation." The hint of a smile crossed Sledge's face. "With all due respect, Your Honor, my situation can't get much worse than death row." Outside the courtroom, police response units were already assembling. Inside, network cameras continued rolling, broadcasting the scene to millions of Americans who watched in stunned disbelief as their afternoon programming was interrupted by breaking news alerts. "I want to be very clear," Sledge continued, addressing both the room and the cameras he knew were capturing everything. "This isn't about escaping justice. It's about revealing what justice has become." No one yet understood what he meant by those words. No one knew that this dramatic moment wasn't an act of desperate violence, but the beginning of something far more calculated. And no one, not the reporters, not the police, not Judge Vance himself, could have guessed that the gun pressed against the judge's head would lead to revelations that would shake the foundations of the justice system itself. Carla Rivas stared at her client in horror. What had she missed? What was he planning? And most troubling of all, how had a man searched multiple times managed to smuggle a weapon into one of the most secure courtrooms in the state? The answer would prove far more disturbing than the question. 6 months earlier, Carla Rivas sat in her cramped office at the Public Defender's Service, staring at the case file that had just landed on her desk. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as rain tapped against her window, creating a melancholy soundtrack for what she already knew would be a losing battle. Dion Sledge Moreno, she muttered, flipping through the preliminary documents. The name was familiar even to someone who tried to avoid the sensationalist headlines that dominated local news. A former musical prodigy who had somehow transformed into one of Hartford's most notorious gang leaders. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Sandra, the office administrator, poked her head in. "I know that look, Carla. You're thinking of passing on this one." Carla sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Sandra, look at this. The DA's office has been building this case for 2 years. They've got witnesses, circumstantial evidence, and a public that's already decided he's guilty. It's political suicide to defend him, and legal suicide to think we can win." Sandra stepped fully into the office, closing the door behind her. "That's exactly why Moreno needs you, not one of the fresh-faced kids straight out of law school. You're the best we have." "That's not saying much," Carla replied, but she was already flipping back to the first page of the file, her curiosity piqued despite herself. The case seemed straightforward on the surface. Franklin Doyle, a 45-year-old real estate developer, had been found shot dead in his car in an empty parking garage. Security footage showed a figure resembling Sledge in the vicinity shortly before the estimated time of death. 3 witnesses from Sledge's organization had come forward claiming he had ordered the hit after Doyle refused to back down on developing property in his territory. It was the kind of case that made prosecutors salivate, high profile enough to make careers. With a defendant the public was predisposed to vilify. "There's something else," Sandra said quietly, handing over a thin folder that hadn't been with the main case file. "Eleanor Moreno called the office this morning. She's requesting you specifically." Eleanor Moreno, Dion's mother, retired police officer, 23 years on the force. Carla opened the folder to find herself looking at a photo of a stern-faced woman in police uniform, standing beside a teenage boy holding a music award. The contrast between that image and the mugshot in the main file was jarring. "She says there's more to the story," Sandra added. "Says her son is being framed. They all say that. True, but not all of them have mothers who served with distinction in law enforcement for over 2 decades. Carla stared at the photo, finding herself drawn to the pride evident in Eleanor's eyes as she stood next to her son. What had happened between that moment and now? Later that afternoon, Carla sat in a small interview room at the detention center, waiting for her potential client. When the door opened, the man who entered seemed smaller than his reputation suggested. Without the swagger portrayed in media coverage, Sledge was just a man in an orange jumpsuit, with tired eyes and shoulders that carried an invisible burden. "Ms. Rivas," he said, his voice softer than she'd expected. "I appreciate you coming, but I should tell you up front. I don't have money for a private attorney. I'm with the Public Defender's Service, Mr. Moreno. If I take your case, the state pays me." She paused, studying him. "But I need to know why your mother specifically requested me." Something shifted. In his expression, a flicker of the charisma that had reportedly drawn so many young men to his organization. "Because you're the only one who took down Detective James Holloway in court," he replied. "And Holloway is the one who built this case against me." Carla felt a chill run through her. 3 years earlier, she had exposed Holloway's misconduct in a drug case, resulting in the case being thrown out. The detective had never forgiven her, and she'd felt his colleague's resentment ever since. "That doesn't mean I can do it again," she said cautiously. "No," Sledge agreed, "but it means you might be willing to look at evidence that others would ignore." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Ms. Rivas, I've done many things I'm not proud of, but I didn't kill Franklin Doyle. And I think if you start asking the right questions, you'll find out who did, and why they're so determined to, pin it on me." As Carla walked back to her car that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. The rain had stopped, but the night air felt heavy with unspoken truths. She hadn't officially taken the case yet, but she already knew she would. What she didn't know, was that her decision would eventually put her at the center of a conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple murder case, and that her client's apparent courtroom violence would be just the beginning of a story that was anything but simple. The West Side Community Center hummed with activity as 17-year-old Dion Moreno adjusted the microphone. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating the eager faces of neighborhood kids who had gathered for the annual talent showcase. On the front row sat Eleanor Moreno in her police uniform, having come straight from her shift. Pride radiated from her as she watched her son prepare to perform. This was Dion before he became Sledge, narrated Michael Reeves, veteran investigative journalist, as archive footage played on screen. A gifted pianist and songwriter whose compositions were already catching the attention of music schools across the country. The footage showed young Dion playing a complex jazz piece, his fingers dancing across the keys with the kind of natural talent that can't be taught. The audience was mesmerized, particularly a talent scout from Berklee College of Music, who had come specifically to hear him play. What happened next changed everything, Michael continued, his voice dropping, and it was all captured on the community center's security cameras. The grainy footage showed the performance interrupted by the crash of doors being forced open. Police officers in tactical gear stormed into the room, shouting orders that sent children screaming and parents scrambling for cover. The officers, acting on an anonymous tip about gang activity, had raided the wrong event. In the chaos, the camera caught Dion standing frozen at the piano, hands raised. Eleanor rushed toward him, her uniform making her stand out among the panicked crowd. Officer Moreno made a critical decision in that moment, Michael explained over the footage. She chose to be a mother first, a police officer second. The video showed Eleanor placing herself between her son and her colleagues, identifying herself as law enforcement while demanding they stand down. Words were exchanged, words that the security footage couldn't capture, but that witnesses would later describe as Eleanor accusing her fellow officers of racial profiling and excessive force. 3 days after the incident, Officer Eleanor Moreno was suspended pending investigation, Michael stated, as the screen showed newspaper clippings documenting the fallout. The official reason was insubordination and interference with police operations. But according to department insiders who spoke on condition of anonymity, the real message was clear. Loyalty to the badge should have come before loyalty to her son. The documentary cut to Eleanor sitting in her modest living room, older now, her eyes carrying the weight of intervening years. "They transferred me to the worst beat in the city after my suspension ended," she said quietly. "Every night I worked among the most dangerous gangs, responding to the most volatile calls. My backup was always accidentally delayed. The message wasn't subtle. They were hoping I'd quit, or worse." The screen transitioned to home videos showing Dion in the months after the incident. His music had changed, becoming darker, more political. The transformation was visible in his demeanor, too. The open, hopeful expression replaced by something harder, more guarded. "I couldn't protect him from what happened," Eleanor continued. "And I couldn't protect him from what came next. What came next was documented in school records and juvenile reports. Dion, once bound for music scholarships, began skipping classes. His first arrest came 3 months after the community center incident, a minor charge for trespassing that was later dismissed. But it marked the beginning of a pattern. The neighborhood was changing too. Michael narrated over footage of the West Side area from that period. Developers had begun buying properties, forcing out longtime residents. Gentrification was coming, and with it, rising tensions between old and new. The documentary showed clips of community meetings where developers, including Franklin Doyle, presented plans for luxury condominiums and high-end retail spaces. In the back of one meeting room, a teenage Dion could be seen watching intently, his expression unreadable. By 19, Dion had adopted the street name Sledge and gathered following of displaced youth, Michael explained. But contrary to later media portrayals, his early activities weren't typical gang operations. Witnesses described them more as community organizing, sometimes confrontational, but focused on preserving neighborhood identity and preventing displacement. The screen showed footage of Sledge leading protests against evictions, organizing neighborhood cleanups, and, most controversially, intervening when police interacted with local residents. His natural charisma, once destined for concert halls, now commanded street corners. The system failed Dion, Eleanor said in her final interview segment. But Dion didn't just fall, he was pushed. And once they'd created their perfect villain, they needed him to stay that way. The documentary paused on a split-screen image. Young Dion at the piano juxtaposed with Sledge at a community protest. Years later, the transformation was complete, but the underlying question remained unanswered. Was his fall from grace inevitable or engineered? And perhaps more importantly, who stood to benefit from the transformation of a musical prodigy into Hartford's most infamous gang leader? The Hartford Police Department evidence room was clinically lit and meticulously organized, with rows of metal shelves containing the physical remnants of countless crimes. Vanessa Wright, a former crime scene technician with 16 years of experience, moved with practiced efficiency as she guided Michael Reeves through the protocols she had once followed daily. Most people don't understand how crucial chain of custody is, she explained, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had testified in hundreds of trials. Every piece of evidence in a case like Moreno's would be logged, tagged, and tracked. Any break in that chain can compromise an entire case. Michael nodded, jotting notes as they walked. After 3 weeks of investigating Sledge's case, he'd finally secured this interview through a former colleague who owed him a favor. Vanessa had left the department 2 years earlier to teach forensics at the community college, a career change she described as necessary for my sanity. You reviewed the forensic evidence in the Doyle murder? Michael asked. Not officially. I left before the case went to trial. Vanessa stopped walking, checking to make sure they were alone. But I was the primary technician on the initial crime scene, and what I collected doesn't match what was presented in court. Michael felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a potential breakthrough. Can you elaborate? The bullet trajectory, for one thing. Vanessa used her hands to demonstrate. Based on the entry wound and the position of Doyle's body, the shooter was approximately 5'8". Sledge is 6'2". Could Doyle have been in a different position than what was reported? Unlikely. The blood spatter pattern was consistent with him sitting upright in the driver's seat when he was shot. We also recovered partial prints from the passenger side door handle that were too small to match Sledge's hand size. She paused. Those prints mysteriously disappeared from the evidence log. Michael frowned. Any way that could be a clerical error? Vanessa gave him a look that clearly communicated what she thought of that theory. Then there's the surveillance footage. The parking garage had 16 cameras. The prosecution only used footage from one, the only angle that showed someone resembling Sledge entering the structure. The other 15 cameras, which would have shown who else was present, were reported as malfunctioning that night. All 15 cameras failed simultaneously. Exactly. And here's what really bothers me. There was an audio recording from Doyle's phone. His last call was recorded on his voicemail. I personally logged that recording into evidence. Her voice dropped. That recording is also missing. They reached a locked door at the end of the hall. Vanessa swiped her old ID card, which surprisingly still worked, and ushered Michael into a small room with computer terminals. This is where we digitally log everything, she explained, sitting at a terminal and entering her credentials. I shouldn't still have access, but IT was always understaffed. Let me see if I can find the original intake forms for the Doyle case. After several minutes of searching, Vanessa's expression hardened. That's not possible. What is it? The original logs have been altered. According to this, I never logged in an audio recording or those partial prints. She pointed to the screen. See this timestamp? It shows the entry was modified 2 months after I collected the evidence, by Detective James Holloway. Michael made the connection immediately. The same detective who led the case against Sledge, and the same detective who had numerous complaints of evidence tampering dismissed over his career. Vanessa stood abruptly. We should go. I shouldn't have accessed this. As they exited the building, Michael noticed how Vanessa checked her surroundings, her body language tense. In the parking lot, safely away from security cameras, she handed him a small USB drive. What's this? He asked, though he already suspected the answer. Insurance, she replied. I made copies of my original evidence, logs and notes before I left. I had a feeling the Doyle case would eventually come back around. She met his gaze steadily. There's also a copy of the partial transcript I made from Doyle's voicemail recording before it disappeared. What did the recording contain? Doyle was scared. He mentioned, a meeting gone wrong and said he was being followed. Then there was another voice, not Sledge's, telling him to hang up. Vanessa took a deep breath. The last thing on the recording was Doyle saying, "You can't do this. There are council members involved." Michael felt the weight of this revelation. Council members? As in city council? I can't say for certain, but 3 weeks before his murder, Doyle had presented plans for a major development project that required city council approval. A project that would have displaced hundreds in Sledge's neighborhood. She unlocked her car. And one more thing, Reeves. You didn't get this from me. As Michael watched her drive away, he realized just how deep this case might go. What had begun as an investigation into a possible wrongful conviction was expanding into something far more complex. A web of missing evidence, political connections, and development deals worth millions. Later that evening, as he was reviewing Vanessa's files in his apartment, Michael's phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown, but he answered anyway. "Reeves," he said, still scrolling through documents. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar and deliberately distorted. "Stop digging into the Doyle case if you want to stay healthy." Before Michael could respond, the call ended. He stared at his phone for a long moment, then at the documents spread across his desk. Someone was watching him, which meant he was on the right track, and that someone had just made a critical mistake. They had confirmed there was something worth finding. Carla Rivas sat in her car outside the courthouse, rain drumming on the roof as she reviewed her notes from the preliminary hearing. The prosecution's case against Sledge seemed airtight on paper. 3 witnesses placing him at the scene, circumstantial evidence connecting him to the murder weapon, and a clear motive involving territorial disputes with the victim. But something wasn't adding up. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your email. Urgent." Normally, Carla would ignore such cryptic messages, but after 3 weeks of hitting walls in Sledge's case, she was willing to grasp at straws. She opened her laptop, connected to her hotspot, and found an email with no subject line containing only a password-protected file. The password was simply Holloway 1998. Inside were personnel records for Detective James Holloway spanning 2 decades, records that should have been confidential. As she scrolled through the documents, a disturbing pattern emerged. 6 formal complaints of evidence tampering, 4 accusations of witness intimidation, 3 internal investigations, all closed without action. But most troubling was a list of cases Holloway had led that resulted in convictions, predominantly young men of color from gentrifying neighborhoods across Hartford. Many involved properties that were later developed by the same handful of companies. Her phone rang. Same unknown number. "Who is this?" she demanded. "Someone who knows Holloway isn't working alone," replied a male voice she didn't recognize. "Look at case number HC 2019-773. The witness recanted after the trial, claimed Holloway threatened her family. Judge Vance refused to consider." The new testimony. Judge Vance, as in Douglas Vance, who's presiding over Sledge's case. The same. "Did you know he owns stock in Cityscape Development, the company that bought 3 blocks in the West Side neighborhood after Sledge's arrest?" The connection clicked. Franklin Doyle had been a partner in Cityscape. The development Sledge had been protesting was their project. "Why are you telling me this?" Carla asked, her heart racing. "Because Sledge isn't the first, just the most visible." The caller paused. "Check the roof of the Hartford Plaza Hotel tomorrow at noon. There's a camera." Angle the prosecution didn't share. The line went dead. That night, Carla couldn't sleep. The implications were too disturbing. If what her anonymous source suggested was true, Sledge's case wasn't about justice. It was about removing an obstacle to a multi-million-dollar development deal. And the system meant to prevent such abuses was potentially complicit. The next morning, she drove to her office early, intending to research Cityscape Development before heading to the hotel. When she unlocked her door, she immediately sensed something was wrong. Papers were slightly disturbed on her desk. Her chair was not quite where she'd left it. Someone had been there. On her computer monitor, a sticky note bore a simple message in unfamiliar handwriting. "Some cases aren't about justice. Back off or join him." Carla felt a chill run through her body. The threat was clear, but instead of frightening her into compliance, it only convinced her further. She was onto something real, something dangerous enough that someone would risk breaking into her office to warn her away. She pulled out her phone and dialed Michael Reeves, the journalist who'd been asking questions about Sledge's case. It was time to compare notes. What neither of them knew was that across town, Detective Holloway was meeting privately with District Attorney Wesley Palmer, and Judge Douglas Vance was receiving a very important phone call from a prominent campaign donor. The machinery that had been set in motion years ago was accelerating, and Sledge was just one piece in a much larger game. The Hartford Plaza Hotel stood 22 stories tall, its mirrored windows reflecting clouds that threatened rain. Carla Rivas and Michael Reeves met in the lobby, both pretending to be waiting for colleagues, while scanning for surveillance. "Are we being paranoid?" Carla whispered, checking her watch. It was 11:52 a.m. "After what you told me about your office break-in, I'd say we're being appropriately cautious," Michael replied, his eyes tracking a security guard making rounds. At precisely noon, they took the elevator to the rooftop restaurant, which was closed for renovations. A single maintenance worker mopped the floor near the service entrance. When he saw them, he nodded almost imperceptibly and continued working, making his way toward the exit. As he passed, he murmured, "Northeast corner, behind the ventilation unit. 5 minutes, then go." Once the worker had left, Michael and Carla waited anxiously, making small talk about the view while counting down the minutes. When the time was up, they casually made their way to the northeast corner of the roof. Behind the large ventilation unit sat a weatherproof box containing a security camera, one not connected to the hotel's main system. Michael quickly unscrewed the housing and removed the memory card inside. "We need to go," Carla urged, watching the service entrance. "Now." Back in Carla's car, parked 3 blocks away, they inserted the memory card into her laptop. The timestamp showed footage from the night Franklin Doyle was murdered, captured from an angle overlooking the parking garage entrance. "There," Michael pointed as the video played. "That's Sledge entering at 9:47 p.m., matching the prosecution's timeline," Carla confirmed. "But keep watching." 3 minutes later, the footage showed Sledge exiting the garage looking at his phone. This directly contradicted the prosecution's claim that he had remained inside until after Doyle's estimated time of death at 10:15 p.m. "He left before the murder," Michael breathed. "This completely breaks their timeline." "There's more," Carla said as the video continued. At 10:02 p.m., a police cruiser pulled up to the garage entrance. The officer who exited was immediately recognizable. "Detective Holloway," Michael confirmed, arriving 13 minutes before Doyle was killed. At 10:27 p.m., Holloway emerged from the garage alone. He looked directly at the camera as if aware of its presence before getting into his cruiser and driving away. "This is it," Carla said, her voice tight with tension. "This proves Sledge couldn't have killed Doyle, and it places Holloway at the scene during the murder window. We need to get this to the judge," Michael began, but Carla was already shaking her head. "Judge Vance? The same Judge Vance who owns stock in Cityscape and has already excluded evidence favorable to Sledge? We need more before we go official." She stared at the screen. "We need to find the witnesses who testified against Sledge. If Holloway coerced them, they might be willing to recant." The primary witness against Sledge was Terrell Jackson, a former associate who had testified that Sledge ordered the hit on Doyle. Finding him proved surprisingly easy. He was still in Hartford, working at an auto shop in the East End. What proved impossible was getting him to talk. "I said what I said in court," Jackson told them, his hands busy changing oil on a sedan, his eyes never meeting theirs. "That's all I got to say. We have evidence that contradicts your testimony," Michael pressed. "Evidence that could exonerate Sledge." Jackson's wrench slipped, and he cursed under his breath. When he looked up, his face had hardened. but his eyes showed something else. Fear. "You two need to leave," he said quietly. "People are watching me. They know when I get visitors." "Who's watching you, Terrell?" Carla asked, stepping closer. "Holloway?" Jackson's gaze flicked to the street, then back to his work. "I'm supposed to check in if anyone asks about the case. If I don't make that call in the next 5 minutes, I can't guarantee what happens next." "Make the call," Michael said suddenly, surprising both Terrell and Carla. "Tell them we were here, but agree to meet us tomorrow, alone." After a moment's hesitation, Jackson nodded slightly. The next morning, Carla arrived at the designated meeting spot, a public park busy with morning joggers. She waited on a bench, checking her watch repeatedly. Jackson was 20 minutes late. Her phone rang. It was Michael. "Turn on the news," he said, his voice hollow. "Channel 8. As the reporter's solemn voice delivered the breaking news, Carla felt her blood run cold. Terrell. Jackson had been found dead in his apartment, an apparent suicide. The note reportedly apologized for all the lies he had told. But Carla and Michael knew the truth. Terrell Jackson hadn't killed himself. He had been silenced, and they were next on the list. The campaign headquarters for Vance for Senate occupied a former bank building in downtown Hartford. Red, white, and blue bunting draped the windows, and professionally designed posters featured Judge Douglas Vance's distinguished silver hair and practiced smile. Inside, a small army of young staffers coordinated phone banks, managed social media, and planned fundraising events. In a private office at the back, Judge Vance reviewed polling data with his campaign manager, Eliza Bennett. At 57, Vance had the polished appearance of someone born for public office, tailored suits, perfect posture, and the rare ability to appear both authoritative and approachable. "The numbers are strong, Douglas," Eliza reported, sliding a folder across the desk. "Your tough-on-crime messaging is resonating, especially after you denied bail to those carjacking suspects last month." Vance nodded, studying the graphs that mapped his rising approval rating. "And the Moreno case? Public opinion is firmly against him. Your decisive handling of the proceedings has been well received." She hesitated, though there is some chatter online questioning the evidence. Vance's expression darkened slightly. "What kind of chatter?" "Nothing mainstream yet. Just a few legal blogs and social media posts. That reporter, Reeves, has been particularly persistent." Vance closed the folder. "Have our friends at the Herald run the piece on my judicial record. Emphasize the 92% conviction rate. The public needs to be reminded that I keep dangerous criminals off the streets." Their meeting was interrupted by a knock. Vance's assistant entered with a concerned expression. "There's a call for you, sir. He says it's urgent. Martin Reynolds." Vance's demeanor changed instantly. He dismissed both women with a gesture. Once alone, he picked up the phone. "Martin, this is unexpected." The voice on the other end was smooth but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. "Douglas, I've been hearing some concerning reports about the Moreno case. There seems to be some renewed scrutiny." "Nothing I can't handle," Vance replied, unconsciously straightening his tie. "Just a desperate defense attorney and an attention-seeking journalist. They visited Terrell Jackson before his unfortunate decision. Now they're speaking with Amanda Chen." Vance's grip on the phone tightened. "How do you know this?" "I know everything that threatens our investments, Douglas. That's why I've supported your career for the past decade." Reynolds paused. "The West Side Development Project represents over $300 million in potential revenue. Your 12% stake would secure your financial future well beyond your Senate term." "I'm aware of the stakes, Martin." "Are you?" "Because from where I sit, it appears you're allowing a simple murder case to potentially derail everything we've worked for." Vance moved to the window, looking out at the city he hoped to represent in Washington. "What would you suggest?" "Judge Davidson owes me a favor. He could take over the Moreno case, citing your campaign commitments as justification for the transfer, and appear to be running from controversy? That would kill my campaign." Vance shook his head. "No, I need to see this through. The evidence against Moreno is substantial, regardless of what his attorney may think she's found." Then ensure that nothing derails the conviction, Reynolds said coldly. Palmer has been useful in keeping Holloway in check, but this defense attorney is becoming problematic. I suggest you find a way to limit what evidence she can present. After ending the call, Vance remained at the window, his reflection staring back at him from the glass. When had it started? The first compromised ruling? The first campaign contribution that came with unspoken expectations? He couldn't pinpoint the moment, but he knew, with uncomfortable clarity, that there was no going back. His intercom buzzed. "Judge, your lunch appointment with the police union representatives is in 20 minutes. "Thank you, Carol. I'll be ready." Vance straightened his shoulders and adjusted his expression to the confident smile that would soon grace billboards across the state. That evening, as Vance reviewed case files in his chambers, his clerk delivered a motion from Carla Rivas requesting admission of newly discovered evidence in State v. Moreno, including security footage from the Hartford Plaza Hotel. Vance's heart rate accelerated as he read the detailed description of what the footage contained. He reached for his phone, then hesitated, remembering the adage that careful men never put certain things in writing or on record. Instead, he wrote a single word on his ruling form: denied. What Vance didn't know was that across town, Michael Reeves was interviewing a former clerk from Vance's office, a young woman who had kept meticulous notes about the judge's private meetings with developers, including Martin Reynolds, dating back 3 years. And she was finally ready to talk. The forensics lab at Hartford University was quiet after hours. Dr. Samuel Chen, a respected ballistics expert with salt and pepper hair and steady hands, adjusted his glasses as he examined the bullet trajectory model Carla had obtained from the case files. Based on the official report, the bullet entered Doyle's right temple, at a 15-degree downward angle, Dr. Chen explained, using a laser pointer to indicate the path. The prosecution argues this is consistent with someone of Sledge's height firing from the passenger seat. Michael studied the model. "And you disagree?" "Science disagrees, Mr. Reeves." Dr. Chen pulled up the autopsy photos and crime scene measurements on his tablet. Given the height of the victim seated in the driver's seat and the documented angle of entry, the shooter would have been approximately 5'8", not 6'2" like Sledge. Carla looked up sharply. "That matches what Vanessa Wright told us about the inconsistency she found." "There's more," Dr. Chen continued. "The gunshot residue pattern indicates the shooter was between 2 and 3 feet from the victim, essentially standing right at the driver's window, not seated in the passenger seat as the prosecution claims." He split his screen to show 2 different reconstructions, the prosecution's version and his science-based alternative. Side by side, the discrepancy was obvious. "This completely contradicts the official narrative," Carla said, taking photos of Dr. Chen's findings. "With this and the hotel security footage, we have enough to demand a new hearing." Dr. Chen's expression remained cautious. "Miss Rivas, I've testified in over 200 criminal cases. Evidence like this should be definitive, but in my experience, when powerful interests are involved, science often takes a back seat to narrative." "We're not just relying on the ballistics," Michael assured him. "We've also located Amanda Chen, another witness who testified against Sledge. After what happened to Terrell Jackson, she's scared, but she's agreed to meet us tomorrow." As they left the lab, Carla received a text. Notification of Judge Vance's ruling on her motion to admit the new evidence. "Denied," she read aloud, her voice tight with controlled anger, "on the grounds that the defense had ample time to locate and present evidence during discovery. He didn't even address the substance of what we found," Michael remarked as they walked to the parking lot. "Because he can't," Carla replied. "The law requires him to consider exculpatory evidence regardless of timing if it's substantial enough. He's hoping we'll back down." Neither noticed the sedan parked across the street, its occupant photographing them as they parted ways. The next morning, Michael arrived early at the coffee shop where Amanda Chen had agreed to meet. He chose a table with a clear view of both entrances and ordered 2 coffees. At precisely 9:30, a nervous-looking woman in her 30s entered, scanning the room before approaching his table. Mr. Reeves? She asked quietly. Ms. Chen, thank you for coming. She sat, her hands fidgeting with her purse strap. I don't have much time. I told my supervisor I had a doctor's appointment. I understand. We just need to know the truth about your testimony against Dion Moreno. Amanda's eyes darted around the room. I never even met him, not until the courtroom. Detective Holloway told me what to say, that I overheard Sledge ordering the hit on Doyle at a bar, but I was never there. Why did you agree to testify falsely? Because they had my brother on. Drug charges. Her voice cracked. Holloway said they'd make sure he got 20 years unless I cooperated. After I testified, the charges against my brother were reduced to a misdemeanor. She reached into her purse and removed a small digital recorder. I recorded Holloway coaching me on my testimony. I was scared to come forward after what happened to Terrell, but I can't live with this anymore. As Michael reached for the recorder, movement at the entrance caught his attention. Detective James Holloway had just walked in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Amanda saw them too, her face drained of color. You said you came alone. I did, Michael assured her, but it was too late. She was already standing, backing away from the table. Holloway spotted them and started making his way through the crowded shop. Michael quickly pocketed the recorder and stood. Ms. Chen, we need to go. Now. But Amanda was already rushing toward the back exit. Michael followed, looking back to see Holloway pushing past customers in pursuit. Outside in the alley, Amanda was nowhere to be seen. Michael turned left, hoping to circle back to his car, when a hand grabbed his shoulder. Mr. Reeves, Holloway said, his grip tightening. Just the man I've been looking to chat with. Let's talk about obstruction of justice. In his pocket, Amanda's recorder was still running, capturing every word of what would happen next. A confrontation that would reveal far more than Holloway ever intended. The interrogation room at Hartford Police Headquarters was deliberately uncomfortable. Hard chairs, harsh lighting, and a persistent chill that made Michael Reeves wish he had worn a heavier jacket. Detective Holloway sat across from him, flanked by a stone-faced officer who hadn't spoken a word since Michael's arrival. Interfering with witnesses in an ongoing case is a serious offense, Mr. Reeves, Holloway said, his tone conversational despite the implied threat. Could mean jail time for an ambitious reporter like yourself. Michael maintained eye contact. I was conducting interviews for a story. Last I checked, journalism isn't a crime in Connecticut. No, but witness tampering is. Holloway slid a folder across the table. We have photos of you meeting with Terrell Jackson the day before his unfortunate suicide. And now Amanda Chen goes missing right after your little coffee date. Missing? Michael's surprise was genuine. What do you mean missing? She never returned to work after your meeting. Her apartment's empty. Holloway's smile didn't reach his eyes. People connected to this case seem to have bad luck after talking to you. The implication was clear, but Michael refused to be intimidated. Seems to me they have worse luck after talking to you, Detective. Holloway's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Reeves. There are powerful people who want this Moreno business finished. People who don't appreciate some washed-up journalist stirring up trouble. Like Martin Reynolds? Michael asked, watching closely for a reaction. The flicker in Holloway's eyes confirmed his suspicion. You're out of your depth, the detective said after a moment. Reynolds has connections you can't imagine. Walk away while you still can. Is that what you told Doyle before you shot him? To walk away? The room went silent. The observing officer shifted uncomfortably. That's a serious accusation, Holloway said, his voice dangerously quiet. So is framing an innocent man for murder. Before Holloway could respond, the door opened. Carla. Rivas entered, followed by Captain Richard Torres from Internal Affairs. This interview is over, Carla announced. My client isn't answering any more questions. Your client? Holloway scoffed. Since when do reporters need attorneys? Since they're being illegally detained without charges, Carla replied. Captain Torres, I believe this constitutes harassment of a member of the press. Torres, a stern man with decades of experience etched on his face, addressed Holloway. Detective, a word outside. As they left, Carla quickly sat beside Michael. Are you all right when you didn't show? Up for our meeting, I started making calls. I'm fine, Michael assured her, but Amanda Chen has disappeared. Carla's expression tightened. That's why I brought Torres. He's one of the few I trust in the department. Eleanor Moreno saved his life years ago. He owes her. Michael lowered his voice. I have something. He subtly indicated his pocket where the recorder remained. Chen gave it to me before Holloway showed up. It's her being coached on her testimony. Carla's eyes widened. That's exactly what we need. But we can't let Holloway know you have it. When Torres and Holloway returned, the detective's demeanor had changed. You're free to go, Reeves, this time. Outside the precinct, Torres walked them to Carla's car. Whatever you two are into, be careful, he warned. Holloway's protected from somewhere high up. Even as IA, my hands are tied without concrete evidence. What? About a witness tampering recording? Michael asked. Torres looked surprised, then grim. That would help, but you'd need somewhere safe to release it. Holloway has friends in the DA's office, the clerk's office, even the local media. I have contacts at the Boston Globe, Michael suggested. Outside Holloway's sphere of influence. Do it, Torres advised. And watch your backs. If Amanda Chen really is missing, he didn't need to finish the thought. If their witness had been silenced, they could be next. Later that evening, as Michael transferred the recording to his laptop, his apartment buzzer rang unexpectedly. On the security monitor, he saw a hooded figure at the entrance. His finger hovered over the intercom button when the figure looked up, revealing a face he recognized. It was Amanda Chen, alive, but terrified. And she had come to him because there was nowhere else to go. What she told him next would change everything they thought they knew about the Doyle murder and the true reach of the conspiracy surrounding it. Amanda Chen sat at Michael's kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The apartment blinds were drawn, and Carla had arrived 30 minutes earlier, bringing a change of clothes and basic necessities for their unexpected guest. After I ran from the coffee shop, I went home to pack a bag, Amanda explained, her voice steadier now. That's when I saw them. 2 men watching my apartment from a car across the street. Not police. These men wore suits. One was on the phone watching my window. How did you get out? Carla asked. Fire escape to the back alley. I took nothing but my wallet and phone. She looked at Michael. I remembered your address from the business card you gave me. I didn't know. Where else to go? Michael nodded. You did the right thing. What you're about to tell us, is it worth all this risk? Amanda's expression hardened. My brother died last week. Apparent overdose, they said. But Ryan was clean for 8 months. His sponsor confirmed it. Her eyes filled with tears. I did what Holloway wanted. I lied under oath. My brother still died. Terrell's dead too. The truth is all I have left. She pulled out her phone and opened a photo gallery. I worked as an administrative assistant at City Hall for 6 years. That's how I knew Franklin Doyle. He often came in for meetings with the city council about his development projects. She handed the phone to Carla, showing a photo of Doyle with several city officials. 2 weeks before he died, I overheard an argument between Doyle and Councilman Edward Porter. Doyle was threatening to go public about kickbacks related to the West Side redevelopment project. Porter told him to remember who his partners were and what they were capable of. Did you report this? Carla asked. To whom? Porter has connections throughout the department, but I did tell my supervisor. Amanda swiped to another photo, a formal gathering where Detective Holloway stood beside Porter, both men smiling with champagne glasses. 2 days after I reported it, Holloway approached me about my brother's case. Michael connected the dots. So Porter had Holloway pressure you to implicate Sledge. It wasn't just Porter, Amanda continued. The day after Doyle's murder, I was filing paperwork when D.A. Palmer came to see Porter in his office. I heard Palmer say they needed to stick with the plan and that Sledge was the perfect fall guy because of his history. Carla's phone buzzed with a text from Captain Torres. Bank. Records you requested. Urgent. She opened the attached file. Financial records showing substantial deposits to Holloway's offshore account, all following major arrests in gentrifying neighborhoods. There's a pattern, Carla observed, scrolling through the data. Holloway receives payments after removing community leaders who oppose development projects. The amounts increased over time. The largest, $250,000, came 3 days after Sledge's arrest. That explains the sudden promotion, Michael noted. Holloway went from regular detective to task force leader with a significant pay raise. Right after Sledge's preliminary hearing, Amanda pointed to another entry in the records. That name, Martin Reynolds. He's the primary investor in Cityscape Development. I processed his permit applications dozens of times. Michael pulled up his research on his laptop. Reynolds is also Judge Vance's largest campaign contributor for his Senate run. And look at this. He's attended fundraising events with both Porter and Palmer. The connections were becoming clear. A network of officials, developers, and law enforcement working together to remove obstacles to valuable redevelopment projects. Sledge, with his community organizing against gentrification, had been in their way. We need to get Amanda's testimony and these financial records to someone outside the local power structure, Carla said. Federal authorities, maybe. Michael nodded. I have a contact at the FBI field office in New Haven, former classmate. As he reached for his phone, a sharp crack split the air. The window behind them shattered, sending glass spraying across the room. Michael instinctively pulled Amanda to the floor as Carla ducked behind the counter. Are you hit? Michael called out. I'm okay, Carla answered shakily. Amanda? Fine, Amanda whispered, her face pale with shock. They found me. Outside, tires screeched as a vehicle sped away. In the wall opposite the window, a bullet had embedded itself. A warning shot meant to silence them. But it was too late for warnings. The truth was already spreading beyond their control, and with Sledge's trial date approaching rapidly, the countdown had begun. The next move would determine whether justice would finally break through the corruption or be buried alongside the other inconvenient truths of Hartford. The courthouse steps were crowded with protesters holding competing signs, some demanding justice for Sledge, others calling for his immediate execution. The shooting at Michael's apartment had made headlines, but carefully controlled ones. Journalists targeted in gang intimidation, the Hartford Herald proclaimed, implying Sledge's associates were behind the attack. Inside the courtroom, Carla stood before Judge Vance, making her final appeal before sentencing. Your Honor, we have new evidence that directly contradicts the prosecution's timeline. The hotel security footage clearly shows. Miss Rivas. Judge, Vance interrupted. I've already ruled on the admissibility of your alleged new evidence. This hearing is for sentencing purposes only. Carla pressed on. We also have testimony from Amanda Chen recanting her previous statements, claiming Detective Holloway coerced her. D.A. Palmer rose. Your Honor, Ms. Chen has disappeared, making these hearsay claims convenient, but unverifiable. What Palmer didn't know was that Amanda was safely hidden at a women's shelter in New Haven, working with Michael's FBI contact. The bullet from Michael's apartment was being analyzed, and the financial records were under review. But it would all take time. Time Sledge didn't have. Judge Vance's gavel came down with finality. Motion denied. We will proceed with sentencing as scheduled. From his seat at the defense table, Sledge watched with eerily calm eyes. When Carla returned to sit beside him, he whispered, It was always going to end this way. But the game isn't over. Carla looked at him puzzled. What do you mean? Instead of answering, Sledge glanced toward Eleanor in the gallery, a silent communication passing between mother and son. 3 days later, the sentence was delivered. Death by lethal injection. As Sledge was led away, his expression remained unchanged, as if he'd been expecting this outcome all along, and perhaps planning for it. What no one in the courtroom realized was that Sledge had already set in motion his own form of justice, one that wouldn't require judges or juries, just the truth and an audience to witness it. The Boston Globe article hit like a bombshell. Questions surround Hartford murder conviction. Evidence tampering allegations rock high-profile case. Michael's reporting, published outside Hartford's media bubble, detailed the forensic inconsistencies, witness coercion, and financial connections between key figures in the case. The article stopped short of directly accusing officials of corruption, but the implications were clear. Local news stations were forced to cover the story, though most framed it as controversial claims rather than substantive evidence. Social media, however, exploded with the hashtag #YeJusticeForSledge trending nationwide. Legal experts on cable news debated the merits of a new trial. Harvard law professor Eliza Montgomery called the case a textbook example of prosecutorial misconduct, while conservative commentator William Hayes dismissed the new evidence as last-minute desperation tactics. Public pressure mounted. A petition for Governor Wilson to review the case gathered over 100,000 signatures in 48 hours. In his cell on death row, Sledge received updates through Eleanor, who visited daily. "It's working," she told him during one visit. "People are listening." "Is Carla ready?" he asked. Eleanor nodded. "She doesn't like it, but she understands it's our only option now." "And Officer Reed? He's agreed to help." "For me, not for you." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure about this, Dion? It's dangerous." Sledge reached across the table, taking his mother's hands in his cuffed ones. "More dangerous than lethal injection?" His smile was sad. "Some truths need a spotlight, Mom. I'm just providing the stage." Meanwhile, Judge Vance was feeling the pressure. Calls to his campaign office questioned his handling of the case. Several donors requested private meetings to express their concerns about negative publicity. His polling numbers began to slip. In a private meeting with D.A. Palmer and Martin Reynolds, Vance voiced his frustration. "This should have been handled more carefully. Now we have a mess on our hands." Reynolds remained calm. "The execution is scheduled. Once it's carried out, this will all fade away. The public has a short memory." What none of them knew was that Eleanor Moreno had placed a recording device under the conference table during her cleaning shift the previous evening. Every word was being captured, adding to the evidence building against them. The stage was set for Sledge's final act, a performance that would force the truth into the open, no matter the cost. The day of reckoning arrived with unprecedented security measures. Metal detectors were doubled, and every person entering courtroom 317 was thoroughly searched. Outside, media vans lined the streets as a crowd gathered, held back by police barricades. As Sledge was led in, handcuffed and shackled, his eyes scanned the room methodically. Judge Vance sat at the Yitzhak bench, reviewing documents. D.A. Palmer conferred with his team at the prosecution table. Court Officer Thomas Reed stood at his usual position by the judge's bench, his expression unreadable. Carla met Sledge at the defense table. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" she whispered. "There are other ways. Not with the time we have left," Sledge replied quietly. "Trust me." Judge Vance called the court to order. "We're here for the final ruling on the defense's emergency motion to stay execution based on newly discovered evidence." Everyone knew this was a formality. Vance had no intention of granting the stay. As expected, the judge denied the motion with practiced judicial language about insufficient grounds and procedural timing. When he finished, he asked if Sledge had any final statement. Sledge stood slowly. "Actually, Your Honor, I think we've all heard enough words in this courtroom." What happened next appeared chaotic but was meticulously choreographed. Officer Reed, positioned behind the judge, slipped something to Sledge as he approached the bench, a small object that looked like a gun. Sledge moved with surprising speed, positioning himself behind Judge Vance while pressing the object against his temple. Panic erupted. Marshals drew weapons, cameras continued rolling as people scrambled for the exits. "Everyone stay calm," Sledge announced. "Nobody needs to get hurt today." The courtroom fell into stunned silence as Sledge addressed the cameras directly. "What you're witnessing isn't an escape attempt. It's my only chance to tell the truth before they kill me." He nodded toward Officer Reed, who was now holding a small recording device. "Play it," Sledge commanded. Reed pressed play, and Martin Reynolds' voice filled the courtroom. "The execution is scheduled. Once it's carried out, this will all fade away. The public has a short memory." Vance's face drained of color as his own voice responded on the recording, discussing how they had ensured Sledge's conviction despite the evidence. For the next 17 minutes, as SWAT teams surrounded the building and news helicopters hovered overhead, the truth Carla and Michael had uncovered was broadcast live to millions of viewers. The conspiracy to frame Sledge, the development deals worth hundreds of millions, and the officials who had corrupted justice for profit. When the recording ended, Sledge lowered the object from Vance's head, revealing it to be a realistic plastic prop. "I never intended violence. I just needed the world to hear the truth they've been hiding." As officers rushed to restrain him, Sledge looked directly into the cameras. The system didn't fail, it worked exactly as designed, to protect power and property, not people. The footage of Sledge's courtroom revelation dominated the news cycle for precisely 8 hours before the narrative began to shift. Major networks cut the most damning portions of the recording, focusing instead on the courtroom hostage situation angle. Headlines transformed from "corruption exposed in Sledge case" to "death row inmates desperate final act." Cable news panels debated Sledge's tactics rather than the content of his revelations. D.A. Palmer held a press conference denouncing the theatrical stunt designed to distract from Moreno's guilt. Judge Vance, appearing shaken but resolute, called the recordings doctored and taken out of context. In a carefully orchestrated damage control operation, Cityscape Development announced a new community benefit package for the West Side neighborhood, affordable housing units, and a youth music program named, ironically, after Franklin Doyle. Michael watched the manipulation unfold with growing frustration. "They're burying the story right in front of everyone," he told Carla, as they sat in Captain Torres's office, reviewing unedited footage of the courtroom incident. "Not completely," Torres replied, pointing to social media metrics on his computer. "The full video is circulating online. Independent media outlets are covering it. People are asking questions." Carla's phone rang. Her contact at the FBI. "They've expedited the financial investigation based on the courtroom revelations," she reported after hanging up. "But they're still weeks away from possible indictments." "Sledge doesn't have weeks," Michael reminded them. His execution date wasn't changed. That evening, Eleanor Moreno gave an emotional interview on an independent news channel. "My son didn't kill Franklin Doyle. He exposed the people who did, the same people who are now rushing to execute him before the full truth can come out." The interview was watched by millions online, but barely mentioned in mainstream coverage. Meanwhile, in the prison's restricted unit, Sledge received an unexpected visitor, D.A. Palmer himself. "You've made quite a mess," Palmer said, sitting across from the shackled Sledge. "But it won't change anything." Sledge studied him calmly. "It already has. You can control the media, but you can't control what people saw with their own eyes. What I'm offering is simple," Palmer continued, ignoring the comment. "A full commutation to life without parole. All you have to do is retract your accusations. Say it was a desperate ploy to avoid execution." Sledge's laugh was genuine. "You're scared. I'm pragmatic. The governor is concerned about public perception. This deal comes from above me, and if I refuse..." Palmer stood to leave. "Then the execution proceeds as scheduled. Your choice. Live with your lies, or die with your truth." What Palmer didn't realize was that Carla had convinced the prison warden to record all of Sledge's visitors, including this conversation, which was now being added to the growing evidence file. The clock was ticking toward execution day, but the foundations of the conspiracy were beginning to crumble. 3 years later, Carla Rivas sat across from Michael Reeves in the studio where he was, completing his documentary, Manufactured Justice: The Sledge Moreno Story. The walls were covered with timelines, photographs, and news clippings chronicling the case that had changed both their lives. "It still doesn't feel real," Carla said, looking at the final cut playing on the monitor, footage of Sledge's execution, which had proceeded despite the 11th-hour revelations and pending FBI investigation. "None of it does," Michael agreed. D.A. Palmer winning his congressional seat, Judge Vance hosting that legal commentary show, Holloway retiring to Florida with his millions. The documentary showed clips of each man in their new roles, Palmer speaking on the House floor about law and order, Vance analyzing high-profile cases on cable news, Holloway fishing on his luxury boat. But there's the other side too, Michael added, advancing to the next segment of the documentary. The screen showed federal agents raiding cityscape development offices, Martin Reynolds being led away in handcuffs, and headlines about the corruption investigation that had slowly but methodically expanded in the years following Sledge's death. 17 indictments so far, Carla noted. City council members, developers, police officers. Porter is serving 15 years. Reynolds will likely get 20. But not Palmer, not Vance, not Holloway. Michael's frustration was still evident. The biggest fish escaped the net. For now, Carla said, sliding a USB drive across the table. Captain Torres finally got access to the complete ballistics evidence. The bullet that killed Doyle has been definitively matched to Holloway's service weapon. The FBI is reopening the case against all three of them. The documentary's final segment showed Eleanor Moreno at her son's grave, placing flowers beside a simple headstone. Her voice narrated over the image, reading from Sledge's final letter. I wasn't condemned for who I am. I was condemned for who they needed me to be. But in the end, truth doesn't ask our permission to emerge. It finds its way to the light, even if those who speak it don't live to see the dawn it brings. The screen then showed current footage of the West Side neighborhood, not the luxury development that had been planned, but a revitalized community center bearing Sledge's real name, the Dion Moreno Music Academy. Young people entered, carrying instruments, while a mural of Sledge at his piano watched over them. He lost his battle, Michael narrated in the closing moments. But the war for justice continues. The system didn't fail. It worked exactly as designed, protecting power and property over people and truth. The question isn't whether the system needs to be fixed, but whether it needs to be reimagined entirely. As the documentary faded to black, a final piece of text appeared on screen. 1 week after this documentary was completed, federal indictments were unsealed against former District Attorney Wesley Palmer, former Judge Douglas Vance, and former Detective James Holloway for conspiracy, murder, and corruption. This story continues. The truth hadn't set Sledge free, but in death, he had accomplished what he couldn't in life, exposing the machinery of injustice that had claimed him and so many others, and forcing a reckoning that would echo for generations to come.